Sounds True presents The New Physics of Healing with Deepak Chopra. In this live presentation, recorded at the 13th Annual Scientific Conference of the American Holistic Medical Association and Foundation, Dr. Deepak Chopra integrates cutting-edge medical research with ancient Vedic wisdom. According to Dr. Chopra, the human body is a rapidly changing field of energy. In The New Physics of Healing, he discusses how this observation relates to current medical theory, and in particular to the phenomenon of aging. Dr. Deepak Chopra is an expert in Ayurvedic medicine, the ancient healing art of India. He has trained extensively in the United States as well as in India, and is a practicing endocrinologist and former Chief of Staff of New England Memorial Hospital in Stoneham, Massachusetts. Dr. Chopra is the well-known author of Quantum Healing, Exploring the Frontiers of Mind-Body Medicine. His writing has been published in 14 foreign countries, and he lectures widely in the United States, Europe, India, and Japan. And now, recorded live, The New Physics of Healing with Deepak Chopra.
My thought was that this morning I would present to you a new model which is rapidly becoming the new paradigm in medicine, and I take no credit for this model except that it's part of our collective thinking right now, and perhaps I choose other words. Nevertheless, I want to spend this morning talking about the quantum mechanical body, what it is, how in fact if we change our point of view of the body for what it really is, so that it is consistent with the latest science, perhaps it will alter the way we treat it. Some of that alteration is already occurring, and you're part of that change, that phase transition that is occurring in the medical profession at the moment. I just want to spend a few minutes first, though, discussing the mechanics of perception, because once we understand the mechanics of perception, we'll really be able to see quite clearly that our current view of the human body is really frozen in a very obsolete worldview that should have gone away with the overthrow of Newtonian physics. However, it hasn't. You can do some very interesting experiments to, in fact, see how perception gets structured in our physiology. You can take some flies or fleas, whichever you prefer, put them in a jar about this big. After a while, remove the lid, and you'll find that most of the flies will not be able to get out of the jar. They've made a commitment in their body-mind, whatever that is, and we'll go into that in a moment, that that's the limit of their universe. And except for a couple of pioneers, most get stuck in that confined space. In India, when they train elephants, they do something quite interesting. They take a baby elephant and tie it with a flimsy rope to a green twig, which isn't very big. When the animal, and they do that for a few weeks, when the animal grows up to be a big, huge animal now, you can tie it with an iron chain to a tree. It'll snap the chain with one movement, or better still, walk away with the tree. But if you tie it with a flimsy rope to the green twig, it won't be able to escape. It's made a commitment in its body-mind that that's a prison. If you talk to people that work in aquariums, they'll tell you another very interesting phenomena. Sometimes fish are separated from each other in tanks, and there's a glass partition between different tanks, a transparent partition between different tanks, so fish can't move from one tank to another. But after a while, if you remove that transparent partition, the fish still will not be able to go across the tank. They've made a commitment in their body-mind that that's as far as they can go. And there was an interesting experiment done at Harvard Medical School about 20 years ago, which ultimately led to these people receiving the Nobel Prize in Physiology. where a group of kittens were brought up in an environment that had only horizontal stripes. Another group of kittens were brought up in a room that had only vertical stripes. And when these kittens grew up to be wise old cats, it turns out that one group of cats could not see anything other than a horizontal world. Another group of cats could not see anything other than a vertical world. One group would, in fact, bump into furniture legs, not because they didn't believe in their existence, but because they didn't have, in fact, the sensory apparatus, the interneuronal connections to see either vertical or horizontal stimuli. So all these experiments, and there's a lot of data now on the mechanics of perception, are pointing to one very crucial fact, and that is our sensory apparatus and our interneuronal connections develop as a result of our initial sensory experiences and how we are taught to interpret them. And subsequently, we function with a nervous system that has only one reason for its existence: to reinforce what we were exposed to in the first place. To reinforce what we were exposed to and what was interpreted for us in the first place. There's a technical term for this that psychologists use. It says premature cognitive commitment. Premature cognitive commitment. We commit ourselves to a certain cognitive reality, and then these realities are a result of conceptual boundaries that we have structured in our own consciousness. And then even literally, I'm not saying metaphorically here, very literally our nervous system serves to just keep reinforcing the conceptual boundaries that we have structured in our own consciousness. The picture of the world turns out not to be the look of it at all. It's just our way of looking at it, very literally, very literally. This is not, for example, the shape of it or the look of it or the texture of it. That's a function of my receptors, which have been programmed to perceive it only in this way. This is really not the look or texture or smell of it. That's a function of my receptors. The eye cells of a bee, for example, when they look at a flower, they don't see these same colors that you and I see because they don't have the receptors to see those. But they can sense ultraviolet. So when a bee looks at a flower from a distance, it can actually see the honey, but it can't see the flower at all. A bat would see this as the echo of ultrasound. A snake would sense this as infrared radiation. A chameleon's eyeballs swivel on two different axes. We can't even remotely imagine what this room would look like to a chameleon. What's the real look of the world? What's the real texture of it? What's the real shape, etc.? And the answer is, there isn't such a thing. It's infinite possibilities all coexisting at the same time. And we freeze that field of infinite possibilities into a certain perceptual reality, literally, as a result of our cognition, which is a result of premature cognitive commitments. Sir John Eccles, who is a very well-known neurophysiologist, also won the Nobel Prize, amongst other things, for elucidating the mechanics of perception. To quote him, he says, "There are no colors in the real world. No smells, no textures, no scents, nothing of the sort. They're all structured in our awareness. They're all assembled in our awareness." There's a beautiful dialogue between a Vedic master and his disciple in one of the Upanishads, where the Vedic master is enlightened and the disciple is still on his way. After a while, the disciple says, "Do we live in the same world?" Because he sees his master sees things completely differently than he does. And the master says, "Yes, we do. The only difference is you see yourself in the world, and I see the whole world in myself." And that perceptual shift is what science is leading us to also. Science is also leading us in that direction. Today, for example, there is definitely a shift in technology, in the world of technology, that is definitely, for those of us who can notice it, is leading to the overthrow of a superstition that has existed in science for a long time. This superstition is the superstition of materialism. That in fact, the world out there is made up of matter and contains objects that are separated from each other in space and time. And our entire system of logic is embedded in this superstition of materialism. Our entire system of logic today is embedded in this superstition of materialism, which makes sensory perception the crucial test of reality. And when I mean sensory perception, I mean all the extensions of our sensory perceptions, including all our scientific instruments, which are merely prostheses of our senses. Right now, in this moment of time, in most nervous systems, and I'm sure there are exceptions, particularly in this audience, in most nervous systems, though, less than 1/1000th of the stimuli available to us in this room will get into the nervous system. Less than 1/1000th of all the stimuli that are available will get into the nervous system. And which ones are those? Those that reinforce what we think exists out there. Those that reinforce what we think exists out there. The rest is automatically screened off completely. And yet all our technology today is built on the quantum mechanical perspective. Today, for example, anything that we do, such as using the telephone or watching television or using a computer or traveling by a jet plane from here to there or throwing a missile into outer space, all of this is based not on the idea of an atom as a solid entity. They're all based on the idea of an atom as a void of energy, as a void of information. And yet, even though we see the thrones of materialism being overthrown in the world of technology, somehow the superstition still pervades the world of biology. If then this is not really what this is in reality, then what is it? Everything that you really see is ultimately made up of atoms. These atoms are made up of particles that are moving at lightning speeds around huge empty spaces. And those particles themselves are not material objects, but fluctuations of energy in a field of energy. So if you could see the human body also with the eyes of a physicist, as it really is, not through the artifact of sensory perception, because that's what it is. Sensory perception is an artifact. A lot of things that my sensory perception tells me I don't believe anymore, such as the earth is flat, and such as the fact that the sun rises in the east and moves across the sky and sets in the west. I don't buy those things anymore, because I know those not to be the facts. If you could see the human body as it really is, you would see it proportionately as void as intergalactic space. If you could see it through the eyes of a physicist, you'd see a huge empty void and a few scattered dots and spots and some random electrical discharges here and there. That much any physicist will acknowledge. And although the physicists say very little about the nature of this void, the ancient seers of Ayurveda and the Vedic tradition have a lot to say about this void. What is this void? Is it a field of energy? Is it a field of information? What is it really? Does it really create all that we know as mind and matter? What is the nature of this void? And I'd like to get into that in a moment, but I just want to finally discard the old model once and for all, which is so embedded, as I said earlier, in the superstition of materialism. Currently, the model that we have in medicine is a frozen sculpture view of the human body. We look at the body as a frozen sculpture and we try and fix it with magic bullets. If you can't believe you ate the whole thing, you can have a couple of Alka-Seltzer. Can't go to sleep at night, there's always a sleeping pill. If you're feeling anxious, take a tranquilizer. It's supposed to give you tranquility. If you have infection, have an antibiotic. Cancer, there's chemotherapy, radiation, surgery. And the list goes on. You have chest pain, you can pop a nitroglycerin. Better still, have a bypass operation, etc., etc. These are the magic bullets of medicine. And in fact, all our current research is really for other magic bullets, because we confuse the mechanisms of disease with the origin of disease. Many scientists will tell you that in fact we are very scientific. We interfere with the mechanisms of disease. So we have these antibiotics that interfere with the replication of bacteria, or we have these chemotherapeutic agents that interfere with the replication of cancer cells. But it's becoming very obvious that the mechanisms of disease are not the origins of disease. And in fact, interfering with the mechanisms of disease just allows the disease to express itself through alternate pathways. In fact, because of this model, we have a very big problem today in medicine that we as physicians like to avoid. It's estimated through very reliable sources, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, that 36% of patients on general medical services are suffering from iatrogenic disease, which means disease as a result of medical intervention. From the years 1981 to the years 1987, it is estimated that between 1 and 4 million people in the United States may have died as a result of medical treatment. During the same period, there were only 39,000 patients that died from AIDS, about 47,000 from traffic accidents, and about 49,000 or so from the Vietnam War. Those figures are deeply etched in the national consciousness of the world and of the national consciousness of this country, and yet nobody talks about these very alarming figures. Every 24 hours, up to 80% of adults in the United States and the United Kingdom swallow a medically prescribed chemical. It's estimated that there are about 100,000 deaths per year in the United States as a direct result of hospital-acquired infections, as a direct result of the use of antibiotics. And since 1962 up to 1988, there has been a 300% increase in drug addiction as a direct result of medical prescriptions. The street drugs of Colombia have contributed to less than 30% increase in the same period. So it is very clear that medical intervention merely redefines but does not reduce the overall morbidity or mortality in a given population. It just redefines it. So we don't have tuberculosis anymore, and we don't have polio anymore, but we have modern epidemics like coronary artery disease, like hypertension, like cancer, arthritis, diabetes, and mental disorders. And I think that is because we have the wrong model. We have the wrong model of the human body in that we think of it in materialistic terms only. We think of the human body as a physical machine that has somehow learned to think, when in fact it may be the other way around. And we'll look into that in a moment. The great sages of Ayurveda describe the body as a river of intelligent energy. And the river analogy is a beautiful analogy. Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, also talked about the mystery of the river, if you recall. And that's the best expression in Veda of what we call Maya. Maya is something that gives you the experience from moment to moment of non-change, but in fact is changing very rapidly. And that's true of the human body also. It gives us the experience of non-change from moment to moment, but in fact It is a field of energy which is rapidly changing and in dynamic exchange with the rest of the universe, which is also a field of energy. And it is exchanging with the universe through certain processes that we call eating, breathing, digestion, metabolism, elimination, which are all, according to the Vedic view, eating, breathing, digestion, metabolism, elimination, breathing, these are all ultimately fluctuations in that field, that void, which ultimately is the void of consciousness. In fact, the physical bodies that you are using to sit on these chairs are not the ones that you walked in with a little while ago. If we want to be totally materialistic about it, we can take any one of a number of processes, and we can take breathing, for example. With each breath that you inhale, you take in 10 to the power of 22 atoms that ultimately become your heart cells and kidney cells and brain cells and skin cells and so on. With each breath that you exhale, you breathe out 10 to the power of 22 atoms that ultimately come from your heart and kidney and liver and so on. You're breathing out bits and pieces of your organs, and in fact we're exchanging them with each other all the time. These well-defined edges to the body are merely artifacts of sensory perception. We are part of a cosmic body that's constantly in exchange with its own self. In fact, very reliable calculations reveal that right now in your body you have 1 million atoms that were once in the body of Christ, or Buddha, or Genghis Khan for that matter. And you have no control over this fact. 98% of all the atoms in our body are replaced in less than 1 year. You make a new liver every 6 weeks, a new skin once a month, a new stomach lining every 5 days. Even the brain cells that you think with as physical atoms, as carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, they weren't there last year. And the DNA, which holds the memory of millions of years of evolutionary time, the raw material of it is replaced every 6 weeks. So if we think we are our material body, then we certainly have a dilemma: which one are we talking about? The 1990 model is not the same as the 1989 model. And if you want to be a stickler about it, you want to account to the last atom, every atom in the last sinew, in the last tendon, then in less than 4 years we replace our entire body down to the last atom. In 1 year, 98% of it. So the physical expression of the body is merely that river, really. It's merely the river. There is something underlying that that is much more fundamental. Now, if you want to ask a physicist about the nature of reality, they'll say all kinds of things, like, ultimately all of matter comes from energy fields and matter fields. They call these both matter fields on the one hand and fields of energy on the other, that these fundamental forces of nature are things like gravity, electromagnetism, strong interaction, weak interaction. This is the language of physics, that everything is ultimately these forces of nature. I think we understand what these forces are. Electromagnetism is that which is responsible for heat and light. We experience it all the time when we do anything. Gravity is what makes the world go around, holds the planets together. The strong force is that which holds the nucleus of an atom together. And the weak force is responsible for radioactive decay. And that's all there is. These forces are the whole universe. Somehow they manifest themselves as sound, as texture, as form, as objects of taste and smell. And we assemble them, interpret them as the material objects of the universe, including our physical bodies. What about mind? And here is where the physicists balk. They don't have any place for mind in this model. They say the forces of nature come from one fundamental unified field, one singularity that expresses itself as then these forces of nature, which leads to the infinite diversity of the universe, that in fact engenders through its own self-interaction even space and time, that space, time, matter, energy are all from this unified field. But they won't talk about mind. In fact, a few months ago, I was in Copenhagen at the Niels Bohr Institute, which is, as you know, the birthplace of quantum physics. And I was trying to present the quantum mechanical model over there. And one very angry physicist got up and he said, we accept the model of the unified field, but why do you have to call this field a field of intelligence or consciousness? Why do you have to bring that into the equation? And I responded to him by asking him if he thought he was intelligent. And after a few seconds, he said, yes, I would like to think so. And obviously, the next question is, are you part of the field or aren't you? Because if you're not, then step out of it. Show me how. The fact is that if matter, energy come from the same unified field, so does mind. And in fact, this is the new paradigm. It's not just that these force fields are fields of energy. These force fields are fields of information. And in fact, recently again at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, I was again trying to present this model, and one physicist at the Soviet Academy of Sciences put it very well. He said, in the past we used to think of matter and energy being interconvertible, as in the famous equation E is equal to mc squared. Now we must put into the equation information, intelligence, knowledge, consciousness. It's not just that at the most fundamental level, matter, energy, and information are identical. And whilst the force fields are fields of force, they are also fields of information. They're also fields of knowledge. In fact, if you have any familiarity with the so-called Heisenberg uncertainty principle, then you realize that a particle is a wave, and a wave is the statistical probability of finding a particle here or there at the moment of attention. Which means that the wave is in fact a wave of information. It's a probability amplitude. Interestingly enough, this is exactly the model that the Vedic seers of India cognized in their own awareness in deep states of meditation when they transcended the senses. When they went beyond the senses, they cognized or realized that in fact this is the nature of reality. And they said we cannot see the whole with bits of perception, and that's all we have, bits of perception. In order to see the whole, we must go beyond the senses, and then we'll have the experiential knowledge of our true nature, which is this basic underlying field. And in the Gita, in chapter 13, verse 2, Krishna gives Arjuna the secret of immortality. He says, know yourself as the field and the knower of the field. So let's go back to that model for a moment, that void which is proportionately as large as intergalactic space. What is the nature of this void? Is it an emptiness of nothing, or in fact is it a fullness of non-material intelligence? And the Vedic scriptures will tell us that in fact this is a fullness of non-material intelligence, which interacts with its own self and creates both mind and matter. That we are not physical machines that have learned how to think. We are in fact impulses of intelligence thoughts that have learned how to create the physical machine. That consciousness interacts with its own self and ultimately creates both mind and matter. That matter is the epiphenomenon and consciousness is the phenomenon. It is consciousness that conceives, governs, constructs, and actually becomes the physical body and ultimately the whole universe. In other words, to think is literally to create. But that thinking is at a very primordial level, not verbal, at a very primordial level. And in fact, at those levels, it is just frequencies of consciousness which interacts with its own self. And these frequencies of consciousness create both mind and matter. This is the model of Ayurveda. And now science is, of course, telling us that, in fact, this may be true. Thanks to the work of scientists like Dr. Candace Pert and others, we are familiar with the whole story of the neuropeptides. These are the chemical equivalents or the biochemical equivalents of thought. When you have a certain thought, or when I say thought, I don't necessarily mean the fully developed, verbally elite thought that expresses itself in the English language with a certain accent. But when you have any idea, any notion, etc., it transforms itself into a molecule. To think is to practice brain chemistry. The way your neurons communicate with each other is through this language of neuropeptides, which are the biochemical equivalent of thought. So that's how neurons communicate with each other. These neuropeptides are like little messenger molecules that fit into the receptors on other cell walls. Now, what has become very obvious in the last few years is that there are receptors to the neuropeptides not only in brain cells, but in other cells of the body. So your lymphocytes, monocytes, T cells, B cells, cells of the immune system, also have receptors to the neuropeptides. In other words, these cells, the lymphocytes, which help us fight against cancer and infectious disease and so on, literally eavesdrop on everything that you're saying to yourself in every moment of your existence. Not only that, the lymphocytes, monocytes, can make the same peptides that the brain makes when it thinks. Now, if that's the case, then we come to a startling conclusion. The immune cells are thinking cells because they make the exact chemicals the brain makes when it thinks. In fact, currently, a good neuroimmunologist will tell you there's no way for him to tell the difference between the immune system and the nervous system. They are parallel systems. One is, in fact, just a circulating nervous system. Now, the story becomes very much more interesting in that as scientists begin to look elsewhere in the body, they find receptors to these biochemical messengers everywhere in the body, in stomach cells, in intestine, in colon, in heart, in lung, in kidney, etc. Everywhere, the same receptors to the same chemicals. Not only that, each cell in the body is capable of making the same chemicals, the same chemical messengers the brain makes when it thinks. So when you say, I have a gut feeling about such and such, you're not speaking metaphorically anymore, you're speaking very literally because your gut makes the same chemicals that the brain makes when it thinks. In fact, your gut feelings may be a little more accurate because the gut hasn't yet evolved to the stage of self-doubt. So it's pretty sure of its own thinking. So too with your heart, so too with your kidney. When you say, my heart is sad, or it's full of love or compassion, then you're speaking very literally. The heart is a thinking organ. And this thinking occurs as a field phenomenon simultaneously everywhere all at the same time. This is the most fascinating aspect of this field model. For example, if I have the idea I'm thirsty, if I have that idea that I'm thirsty, then immediately my cortex makes something called angiotensin II. It's the molecular equivalent of the notion I'm thirsty. It modulates my behavior in such a way that I start looking for water. But at the same time, The pituitary makes angiotensin II, which causes the secretion of another hormone called ADH, which makes the body hold on to water. The heart makes angiotensin II, which makes the heart hold on to water. The lungs make angiotensin II, which makes the lungs hold on to water. The kidneys make angiotensin II, which prevents you from passing too much water into the urine. Everywhere, every cell has simultaneously had the idea, I want water. So where was the idea before? The idea was before in the void of consciousness, in the field of all possibilities. And then it became a probability amplitude simultaneously everywhere, in every cell of the body, and then it became that particle in every cell of the body also. The field manifested as the probability wave, the amplitude, and then it was the molecule everywhere all at the same time. We have a thinking body, and that body is literally a field of infinite correlation. Infinite correlation, infinite organizing power, and infinite knowledge. These are the three attributes that every religion, every scripture in the world has talked about as omniscience, omnipotence, and omnipresence. And in fact, this is the nature of the body. We cannot confine the mind to the brain anymore. It has escaped. And it's in every cell of our body. And in fact, as we look more into the model, we'll find we can't confine it to the body either. It's non-local, it exists everywhere in the universe. And there's a lot of scientific evidence, by the way, on that also. And all these processes that we talk about, eating, breathing, digestion, metabolism, these are all functions of those movements of fluctuations in this non-local mind of which we are a part. But it exists here. In fact, flowers will change their color, as you might know, depending on whether the earth is warm or cold. If the earth is too warm, they'll change their color and reflect more sunlight so they can cool the earth. If the earth is too cool, they'll change their color, absorb more light so they can warm the earth. They have compassion for the earth. They feel for the earth at a cellular level. And in fact, they are completely aware of everything that's happening everywhere in the universe, as are our bodies. The biological rhythms of our bodies are in fact just mirrors of cosmic rhythms. The so-called circadian rhythm, which occurs as the earth moves on its own axis, is in fact a mirror of a cosmic rhythm. The seasonal rhythms that make us sometimes fall in love in spring or get depressed in winter are again mirrors of a cosmic rhythm. We have rhythms in our body structured at a cellular level that even correspond to the tides, the ocean tides, as they occur with the gravitational effects of the sun and the moon, because we have a primordial ocean inside us which is identical to the one outside. And even the lunar month has corresponding rhythms in our body. So in fact, this is the basis of Ayurveda. There's a very small aphorism in Ayurveda, Yatha Pinde Tatha Brahmande, and if you translate that into English, it goes somewhat like this. As is the atom, so is the universe. As is the microcosm, so is the macrocosm. As is the human body, so is the cosmic body. As is the human mind, so is the cosmic mind. So this is the framework, and in fact, scientists are just beginning to stumble on it. And as we become more and more familiar with it, I am sure that this will ultimately lead to the overthrow of materialism, even in medicine. That we will unleash a host of new therapeutic strategies that we have hitherto ignored because we were stuck in this model, which is really very obsolete and is based on a superstition. Is there any evidence in either laboratory or clinical medicine that supports this point of view? Of course, there is all this evidence with the neuropeptides or immunomodulators or whatever other term we want to use to define these chemical messengers that are, in fact, the material equivalent of impulses of intelligence. But there are other studies, both laboratory studies and clinical studies, that in fact support this contention also. Aside from the whole neuropeptide story, there are other fields that are cropping up in medicine known as psychoneuroimmunomodulation, psychoneuroimmunology, psychoendocrinology, and now psychocardiology and psychogastroenterology and all that. And these are very interesting areas for the clinician, and they come from a series of observations that have been made in the last 20 years or so. One of the pioneers in this field was Dr. Herbert Specter at the National Institute of Health, who did some studies about 15, 20 years ago, where he gave mice some injections of a chemical known as poly-IC. Poly-IC is an immunostimulant. If you give injections of poly-IC to an animal or to any living species, it stimulates their immune system. And after a while, what he did was, he had the mice smell camphor at the same time. And he found that if he did this enough times, what would happen is that if the animals were just exposed to the smell of camphor, they stimulate their immune system. He took another group of mice and he gave them cyclophosphamide, which has the opposing effect. It destroys the immune system. He had them smell camphor at the same time, and after a while, they just have to smell camphor, and they destroy their immune system. Now he has two groups of mice. One, he gives a little pneumococci, a whiff of pneumococcus, and they die of pneumococcal pneumonia very shortly. The other group of mice, he gives them the same dose of pneumococci and nothing happens. He gives one group of animals carcinogens and they get cancer. Another group of animals, the same carcinogens, nothing happens. The crucial difference between survival and death in these animals is an interpretation of the smell of camphor. And who makes that interpretation? The self, that field, makes that interpretation. And that self, that field, that consciousness is not confined to the brain. It's in every cell of the body, in the immune cells. Those immune cells remember the last time they smelled camphor. And then they interpret that last memory as an instruction. Destroy the immune system or stimulate the immune system. So those are thinking immune cells that have memory. And in fact, this is how we too structure conditioned responses through our life as a result of interpretations of our own memories. These memories we link to certain experiences, and then we get imprisoned in the conceptual framework, or we might say in the conceptual boundaries of our own interpretations. And this imprisonment in the conceptual boundaries of our own interpretations, in the Vedic tradition, we call this bondage or ignorance, the state of bondage. And we are bound to nothing other than ideas of our own imagination. And the whole goal of Ayurveda, at least the way it has been structured for us in our transcendental meditation movement, is to break out of these conceptual boundaries that we have structured in our own awareness.
This concludes Side A. Please turn the tape over for Side B.
There are many, many clinical stories now, many of them that I don't need to go into detail of, that show, in fact, that almost every disease can be accounted for if we have a good understanding of this quantum mechanical framework of the human body-mind, and how, in fact, our bodies are nothing other than fields of ideas, fields of interpretations. Just recently, the HEW, the Health Education Welfare Department in the state of Massachusetts, did another look at so-called risk factors for heart disease. And of course, if you ask somebody what are the risk factors for heart disease, they'll tell you very clearly that, oh, smoking and hypertension and family history and cholesterol and so on. Well, you'll be interested to know that, in fact, these aren't the most important risk factors. The two most important risk factors, as ascertained by this very comprehensive analysis, the two most important risk factors for death from coronary artery disease are, number one, self-happiness rating, and number two, job dissatisfaction. You go out in the street and you ask people two questions. Number one, are you happy? And number two, do you love your job? And if they can honestly say yes to both questions, they're probably going to be all right. In fact, all the other risk factors are expressions of these two primary risk factors. Now, one of the most remarkable findings as a result of this study was, one of the most remarkable observations as a result of this study was, that more people die in our culture of heart disease on one particular day of the week. And I'm sure you can guess which one that is. Right, Monday. And guess what time? Right, 9 o'clock in the morning. More people die in our culture of heart attacks than any other time of the week. Now, that is really an astounding fact. As far as I know, we as a human species are the only ones who have accomplished this very extraordinary feat. Presumably, no other animal knows the difference between Monday and Tuesday. What is the difference? The difference is an idea, a notion, a concept, what it means to us. It's just an interpretation. And this interpretation is the crucial difference between survival and death from the number one killer in our culture. And there are many other similar pieces of evidence that show what this hypothesis, that in fact the body is this field of ideas, and that the ideas don't crop up first in the brain and elsewhere. They are simultaneously everywhere. Before they are in the field, they are in the field of infinite possibilities. Then they become probability amplitudes, and then they are material expressions simultaneously all over in every cell of our body. In fact, they're not even confined to our bodies. And I'm not going to go into that evidence now, but every idea is in fact part of a global mind and pervades the whole collective consciousness of the whole universe at the same time. Recently, it has become clear that for every single emotion or idea or thought that we can experience, there is a corresponding molecule. At least that hypothesis is definitely getting more and more evidence. For example, if you feel tranquility, whatever the reason for your tranquility, then your body makes Valium. And interestingly enough, the Valium is identical to the benzodiazepine molecule that Hoffmann-La Roche makes. Identical. So obviously our receptors weren't designed for the benefit of Hoffmann-La Roche. They were there because we have the ability to make Valium. And this Valium, this benzodiazepine, is secreted in just the right amounts with the experience of tranquility. It doesn't make us feel like a zombie. Rather, in fact, it is the molecular equivalent of tranquility at the cellular level. And it's made not just by brain cells, it's made by monocytes, it's made by macrophages, it's made by kidney cells, it's made by heart cells. It modulates the activity of macrophages and monocytes so they can do their job in tranquility. They do it much more effectively. If you're feeling jittery, then your body makes jittery molecules everywhere. They're not just adrenaline from the adrenal gland, but in fact, even if you measure the adrenaline levels and noradrenaline levels of the platelets, you'd find they're extremely high. You have jittery platelets, and they huddle together in their fright, and that's what leads to the whole clotting cascade. These are anxious, nervous, jittery platelets. If you're feeling exhilarated, then your body makes, it seems, interleukin-2. This evidence is just coming out, and it's very fascinating in that when you feel stressed or frightened, which is just your perception of what you perceive as a physical or psychological threat, then interleukin-2 levels go down. Not only do interleukin is a very powerful anti-cancer drug. Like interferons, interleukins are also extremely powerful immunomodulators and anti-cancer drugs. And if you're under a lot of stress, and this work was done by Dr. Ronald Glacier at the Ohio State University, where he showed that in medical students at the time of examinations, interleukin-2 levels go down. And not only do the interleukin-2 levels go down, the levels of the receptors to interleukin-2 also go down. And he was finally able to show that the messenger RNA that translates the information from the DNA, the messenger RNA activity is down in these medical students at the time of examination. And in fact, even the DNA that translates that information to the RNA, the DNA has a lower activity in the genetic code that transcribes or translates that information into RNA. So your DNA literally eavesdrops on the interpretations that you're making to yourself in every moment of your existence. There's no cell, there's no molecule, there's no part of the machinery that doesn't listen in to every single impulse of intelligence. It turns out that if you feel exhilarated, then your interleukin-2 levels go up, whatever the reason for the exhilaration. As I said earlier, it's a very powerful anti-cancer drug. Recently it was marginally approved by the FDA for controlled studies in kidney cancer and melanoma, because it's very effective. Even one course of interleukin-2 can wipe out kidney cancer and melanoma in some patients. The only problem is it's extremely expensive. One course of interleukin-2 costs about $40,000 at the going rate, US. And it turns out that if you're feeling exhilarated, whatever the reason is, let's say you're going on a joyride on Magic Mountain in Disney World, you can make millions of dollars worth of interleukin-2. Provided, of course, that's your idea of fun. If it isn't your idea of fun, then you won't make interleukin-2, you'll make those jittery molecules. Interleukins, neuropeptides, interferons, benzodiazepines, all these are material expressions of our internal dialogue. And that internal dialogue is not confined to the brain cells. I hope that I have said that so many times. The body is just a printout of consciousness. If you just change the way you looked at your body, the body would change, because the body is in fact nothing other than an interpretation. So you change the interpretation, the material expression should change. Not change the interpretation at some superficial level by talking to yourself and saying, oh, my body is this expression of consciousness, but having that experiential knowledge that in fact I create my body by curving back within myself at these primordial levels. All our interpretations come about as a result of sensory experiences. Our interpretation of time is one such event. Einstein is quoted as saying, he had this beautiful expression, at what time does the train leave the station, or at what station does the train leave the time? Depends on your perspective, your focus of attention. And it is becoming clear that time is not some independent entity out there, but in fact our interpretation of how we measure our perception of change. In fact, no physicist has ever proved the existence of time. Sir Thomas Gold, who is a very contemporary quantum field physicist, is quoted, as is our friend Stephen Hawking, as saying that, in fact, the description of the universe as having linear time with a past, present, and future is not an accurate description of what the universe is like. Those past, present, and futures are constructed totally as a result of our interpretation of our perception of change. The time doesn't really exist, only eternity exists. Time is a concept. Time is a concept, eternity is the reality. Stephen Hawking again says the universe is without beginning in time, without ending in time, no edges in space. Try and conceive of that, and you can't. It's non-conceptualizable. It is, in fact, the only reality. Everything else is a concept. You can try it out. Close your eyes and think of a universe that had a beginning in time, and immediately you are with the paradox, what was there before the beginning? So if you say, well, okay, there wasn't a beginning, it was without a beginning, and you can't conceptualize that either. Try and imagine an end, and the obvious question comes up, what is there after the end? So you can't conceptualize that. So you say, okay, it has no end, and you can't conceptualize that either. You say it has outer limits in space, and then obviously the immediate question crops up, what is there after the outer limit? So you say, okay, there aren't any limits, and you can't conceptualize that either, because it is non-conceptualizable. Space and time are, in fact, concepts, completely. And they are concepts that come about as a result of the artifact of sensory experience. I create space as a result of interpretation of my senses. I see this object, which is, in fact, nothing other than a squiggle or a wiggle in the unified field. It's a bunch of concentrated energy. I look at this, and this is also a bunch of energy. There's a lot of energy in between, but my senses don't perceive it. This energy is as powerful and as real as this energy and this energy, but because my senses don't register it, for example, my eye cells can only see between 375 and 385 billionths of a meter. There's nothing sacred between 370 and 375, but as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't exist. So I create the concept of space. And then I have a few balls moving around, and I create the concept of time. These are concepts which have really no basis in reality, but because our bodies are fields of concepts, fields of ideas, we structure as a result of our interpretation of time, we metabolize our experience of time, and we construct it. We structure biological entropy. Ultimately, time is only a concept. I can give you some very simple examples, hopefully, that may make that a little clear. A few weeks ago, I traveled from Boston to London, and I met this old friend of mine, and we were having such a good time that time flew. The flight was 6 hours, but it seemed like we were there in a jiffy, as the expression is. What happened? Our perception was that we were there in almost like 20 minutes. We forgot to eat, we forgot to go to the bathroom, we forgot to sleep. All these biological functions that are part of the expression of time were in fact altered, as a result of which even those biological functions that mirror time changed. Cycles of sleep and wake, cycles of appetite, cycles that have to do with our biological rhythms. In fact, when we got there, we didn't even have the experience of jet lag, which we should have. Why? Because our perception was, quotes unquote, as a result of our own interpretation, that time flew. Or you've heard the expression, very common in our society today, I'm running out of time. I have 10 deadlines to meet, and I'm constantly running out of time. people who have that internal dialogue, that perception of time, they look at the same clocks and watches that I look at and you look at, but for them, it seems to be moving faster because their perception of time mirrors their own internal dialogue of time is running out. And in fact, if you measure their biological functions, you'll find that all their biological functions, their biological clock, is a function of that perception of time. So if you measure their adrenaline levels, they are higher. If you look at their heart rate, it's faster. If you look at the number of arrhythmias per hour, they are more frequent. If you measure glucose, growth hormone, insulin, glucagon, anything that you measure, it's all in the fast lane. And when such a person drops dead of a premature coronary, then time has run out, literally. They take that internal dialogue, which is a frequency of their own consciousness, and they translate it into biological entropy, which is a function of how we metabolize our experience of time. Of course, we have so many expressions in the language vis-a-vis time. Time drags, time flies, or perhaps one that is the best experience of all. When you say the beauty of the mountain was breathtaking, time stood still. And that expression itself is very indicative of what is happening in our physiology when time stands still. Say the beauty of the mountain was breathtaking. Time stood still. Because when time stands still, breath stands still also. Breath is nothing other than what the Vedic scholars call prana, which is nothing other than the movement of consciousness. It's the movement of thought. And in the moment of a unity experience, or a peak experience, or a transcendental experience, when consciousness completely stands still, then there is no movement of thought. Then even the breath comes to a standstill. And in fact, time ceases to exist. That is the moment when one is grounded in the experience of infinity, of immortality, of eternity. That is when one has transcended all concepts. And at that point, there is only the reality, which is the continuum of infinity without beginning in time, without ending in time. In fact, if you look at one of the most ancient texts of the Vedic tradition, the Yoga Vasishtha describes that same experience. It calls it bliss. It says bliss is the effortless suspension of breath. Bliss is the effortless suspension of breath in the moment of unity, when the observer, the observed, and the process of observation are all one ground state of samadhi. Samadhi is that experience of transcendence where there is no difference between the observer, the observed, and the process of observation. In fact, the observer is the observed, and the process of observation is both the observer and the observed. There is only that experience of unity consciousness, and it is therefore the experience of immortality. So it's clear also that time is nothing other than the movement of consciousness. Time is nothing other than the movement of thought. And in fact, how we perceive our perception of change is nothing other than interpretations that the self makes to the self. And how it does this influences processes that influence biological entropy and in fact are responsible for phenomena such as aging itself. Linear time is an artifact of sensory experience. It is not the reality. The flow of linear time is a completely and totally psychological event. Completely and totally a psychological event. However, it shapes the reality of our body, and it also shapes the reality of the universe that we live in. Unfortunately, this happens through a process of indoctrination, both cultural and social, and it's basically the hypnosis of social conditioning that we all become victim to, and then we take that to be the reality. With that as the basic background, I thought what I'd do is to cover some ground on what we know today about the factors, the psychophysiological factors, that we know today that influence biological entropy and also the aging process. So the first factor that influences aging and biological entropy is nothing other than our own premature cognitive commitments. Premature cognitive commitments are concepts that come about as a result of initial sensory experiences and how we have learned to interpret them. In fact, those premature cognitive commitments are not just things that happen to human beings, they happen in all biological species. Even insects make them, and fish make them, and elephants make them, and so it's quite obvious that this phenomenon is not just restricted to the human species. Some very interesting work in this area was initially done by a scientist by the name of Alexander Leaf, who is currently still a professor of preventive medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Alexander Leaf did this work on the epidemiology of aging about 20 years ago when he retired as chief of medicine from the Mass General Hospital at Harvard Medical School. And what he did was he traveled around the world looking at populations in the world that age differently, where there's a different expression of aging on a larger societal level. These populations exist in many parts of the world. The Hindu Kush Mountains are one area. Afghanistan, certain parts of Afghanistan, another area. Certain parts of the Soviet state of Georgia, another area. And southern Andes in South America, another area. You have populations that have a large number of centenarians, and in fact people living up to 110, 115 years, a large number of them, and all in good health. In fact, Dr. Leaf brought back some very interesting photographs from these areas of people of those ages, and some of them were even smoking cigarettes. And he showed that these people were in very good health. And he tried to see what was the common factor that was prevalent in these populations that showed this very successful expression of biological aging. Was it the weather? Was it something in their diet? Was it a genetic predisposition? And so on. And after a lot of collection of data, he came to the conclusion that in fact it was none of the above, that in fact it was the collective perception of aging in these populations that resulted in a different individual expression of aging. In these parts of the world, to become old was considered to be an enviable thing. The older you got, the more respected you were, the more venerated you were, the wiser you were, and the more older you got, the more useful you were looked upon by society. So to get older was to become wiser, to become more responsible, to become more functional. And that collective perception of aging, people envied older people, resulted in an individual expression of aging that was quite different. This was the first clue that what the collective perception in a society is, in fact, influences individual perception at less than conscious levels of awareness and translates those perceptions into a certain physical reality. Subsequently, in fact, no, earlier than that, there was another very interesting observation that was made on the Tarahumara Indians, which is a certain tribe in South America. And this is actually a very remarkable and astounding story. And again, because it doesn't fit in with our usual conceptual framework, even though the studies were well documented, published, etc., they were soon forgotten and nobody talks about them anymore. It was known, for example, that in the Tarahumara Indians of the southern Andes, and unfortunately that tribe has become or is becoming extinct now ever since Budweiser beer and television and a few other things were introduced into that population. But in this group of Indians, there was the collective belief that as you got older, you got physically better. In fact, they have a tradition, or they had a tradition of running, where one chief would send messages to another chief through runners. They didn't have telephones. They had these men who would run from one place to another. And the belief was that the older you got, the better your running got. So the 20-year-olds were good runners, but the 30-year-olds were better. And if you thought the 30-year-olds were good, you wait till you see the 50-year-olds. And if you thought they were good, wait till you see the ones in really peak performance. They're over 60 years old. And even after that, they plateau. They had none of the usual degenerative diseases that we are familiar with. They didn't have the usual things that we see with aging, such as hypertension, etc. They lived well into their hundreds, and they ultimately died in their sleep without any significant chronic illness. And they were always in peak performance. In fact, when American physiologists studied these people, some of the findings were enough to blow all conceptions about what we today have as the expression of aging. For example, the older you got, the lower your blood pressure got. The older you got, the slower your heart rate became. The older you got, the better your vital capacity became of the lungs, and so on. These documented observations should have been enough to completely destroy every single concept that we have in physiology. But so strong is this hypnosis of social and even scientific conditioning that we have these concepts that we are so attached to that when a study like that comes, we call it anomalous and we throw it away. Because it doesn't fit with the usual thinking. Most recently, a study was done by Dr. Ellen Langer of Harvard University, and she did this study about 3 years ago in 1986. She's a professor of psychology at Harvard University, and she's very well known in her area of conceptual boundaries that we have been talking about. And she advertised in the Boston Globe about 3 years ago in late 1986, she advertised in the Boston Globe that she wanted 100 people to participate in an experiment. And she said that all these 100 people should be over the age of 70. She wanted them all to get together. She took them in a bus outside Boston to some monastery, where for 10 days they were going to play a certain game, and the name of the game was Let's Pretend. And what were they going to pretend? They were going to pretend that they were living in the 1950s, that they were living in 1959, to be exact. And they were going to not only pretend that they were living in the 1959, they were going to talk about it in the present tense. They brought music from the 50s, they brought videotapes from the 50s, most of them in black and white, Groucho Marx, Charlie Chaplin, Laurel and Hardy. They still had, I believe, evening news with Walter Cronkite, except that he looked very young. In fact, he had pimples on his face. He looked like an overgrown teenager, and they had Life magazine with all the articles, and apparently Life magazine was very popular in those days. They had newspapers, everything was from the 50s. In another part of the building, she had other people, controls, also participating in the experiment, but they were also talking about the 50s, but in the past tense. Within 3 days, she took photographs of people after 3 days, And she found, when she showed these photographs to independent observers, people said these people, 3 days later, who were participating in this experiment, looked many years younger. And these were independent observers who had no idea of what, in fact, the experiment was. At this time, Dr. Langer became very interested and decided to call in a bunch of scientists to do biological parameters of aging. Now, that's a difficult thing to do, and there is not really much consensus in the medical profession as to what are the biological parameters of aging. Some scientists do agree on what they could be, though. Things like systolic blood pressure, near-point vision, hearing thresholds, immune system activity, levels of certain hormones, and particularly one hormone that is produced by the adrenal gland called dehydroepiandrosterone sulfate, DHEA for short. It's a steroid hormone that's produced by the adrenal gland, and it has a very slow half-life. It has a very slow metabolic turnover, so it doesn't fluctuate from moment to moment. Well, to make a long story short, she measured as many as 100 parameters of biological aging, some that scientists agree upon and some that are still controversial. And all 100 parameters had reversed at the end of 10 days by at least 20 years. So Ellen Langer showed very elegantly, in fact, that we are the metabolic end product of our sensory experiences. How we interpret them depends on this collective mindset which influences individual biological entropy and aging. Could we have a city of the immortals, so to speak, where we could have a collective mindset that was completely different, that was not bound in these conceptual frameworks? And her response was that society will not let you. That in fact there are too many reminders in our society in every moment of our existence as to what linear time is and how that is supposed to express itself in our biology as entropy and aging. So men get naughty at 40, women get menopause in their 50s, you get social security at 65 and end up in a nursing home thereafter. These are the conceptual ideas that pervade our society, and even though we may think we can escape from them, they are part of the collective mindset. And at a quantum mechanical level, since this is one unbounded field of consciousness, and we are ripples in that field of consciousness, then whatever happens in that field happens in our bodies also. That if we are really going to alter the expression of aging, then not only does the individual mindset have to change, the collective mindset has to change. The global mind has to undergo that phase transition. Hopefully, we're moving in that direction. And this goes back to a very ancient saying in the Ayurvedic tradition that recently Maharishi Mahesh Yogi reminded me of. And he was quoting Adi Shankara, one of the greatest seers in the Vedic tradition, who said the only reason why people age and become old and die is because they see other people becoming old and aging and dying. And we become what we see. We become what we see. And this is an expression which very clearly mirrors or echoes the same thing that modern scientists are saying, in that we are the metabolic end products of our sensory experiences. What we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, what we touch, and how we interpret these experiences, in fact, gets structured in our biology itself. So this is, I would say, one of the most important aspects of healing. Ultimately, it is our individual perceptions and how they mirror the collective perception. Occasionally, somebody will escape from these, but by and large, if we really want to cause a change, then that change has to come as a result of the alteration of the collective consciousness of our whole society, of our whole planet. because unless we do that, that is our body, that is our soul, that is our mind, that is our spirit. If we don't do that, then it will not happen to us either. We have to change that collective mindset which has become programmed and structured along very rigid conceptual frameworks. And these same conceptual commitments, premature cognitive commitments, in the Vedic tradition, the word that Maharshi uses quite frequently is boundaries. What are these boundaries? They are simply conceptual frameworks of how we divide the boundless, how we take eternity and in fact interpret it as all these boundaries of mortality. But mortality is just a spell. It's just a spell that comes about as a result of this hypnosis of social conditioning, and we can break out of that spell and ground ourselves in the field of immortality. That self, the universe, is infinite intelligence, intuition, that whispers to us not as thought, but as the gap between our thoughts, as the silence of transcendence between our thoughts. So I'd like to end with a little quote from my favorite poet, Rabindranath Tagore from India, who was so grounded in the experience of unity. And it's a very beautiful expression that, in fact, summarizes everything I've tried to convey to you. He can say in a few sentences. So he says the following. He says, "The same stream of life that runs through my veins runs through the world and dances in rhythmic measure. It is the same life that shoots in joy through the dust of the earth into numberless blades of grass and breaks into tumultuous waves of leaves and flowers. It is the same life that is rocked in the ocean cradle of life and death in ebb and in flow. I feel my limbs are made glorious by the touch of this world of life, and my pride is from the life throb of ages dancing in my blood this moment." So thank you very much.
This concludes The New Physics of Healing with Deepak Chopra. If you would like additional copies of this recording or to receive a complete catalog of transformational audio tapes, please call Sounds True 303-449-6229 or write 735 Walnut Street, Boulder, Colorado 80302.